So we're now in part 2 of our image crawler case study discussion, where we're going to examine other ways in which we can use completable future features and methods in order to be able to crawl in a recursively structured directory hierarchy asynchronously and count the number of images therein. And this particular part of the lesson, we'll talk about many of the other methods, focusing initially on the countImagesOnPageAndPageLinksAsync method and all the methods that are associated with that particular method. So we'll go ahead and start there, and we'll kind of wind our way through the call chain, and you get to see how all the different pieces fit together. And this will show off a bunch of cool completable future methods and features. So now we're back in my IntelliJ project. Now we're looking at the countImagesAsync method. That's where we left off before in part 1 of the lesson. And countImagesAsync calls this other method, which is quite a mouthful, called countImagesOnPageAndPageLinksAsync. And this is what actually does the bulk of the asynchronous image counting asynchronously. It takes a completable future to a document, which was initiated earlier by the call that used supply async to get the page using the JSoup library. And what we're going to do now is we're going to kind of fork off and do 2 things in parallel. We're going to count the images that are on this page asynchronously when the page has been downloaded. That's the first thing we're going to do. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to crawl the links in the page asynchronously, if there are any, again, when the page future completes. So these 2 calls here, countImagesOnPageAsync and crawl links in PageAsync, will both run asynchronously and in parallel. And we'll look and see how they do that in just a second. Kind of looking at the big picture here, both of these methods are going to return completable futures that will keep track of subtotals of images that were encountered either on that page or by all the pages reachable from this page. And that will emit those totals. Those 2 completable futures will emit those subtotals. And we're going to combine those subtotals together by using this combine counts method. And you'll see how that works once we've taken a look at what these 2 methods do. You'll also notice that countImagesInPageAsync is chained together with the when complete exception handling completion stage method. And it's not really a handler of exceptions, it's more of a logging of exceptions. And if we're going to use this to basically print out what the results are, whether or not an exception was thrown or not. So let's start by taking a look at countImagesInPageAsync, because that one's pretty simple. So what countImagesInPageAsync does is it goes ahead and it returns a completable future that will emit a count of the number of image objects in this page. So when the page future parameter completes, when it triggers, that will invoke the dependent completion stage method, then apply async. And then apply async, which will run in the background in some other thread in the common fork join pool, is going to call this helper method called getImagesInPage. And getImagesInPage is very simple. It takes an HTML document that we got from JSoup, either locally or remotely, and it goes ahead and it selects all the image tags in that page, and it returns an elements collection that contains all those image tags. And all we do is, after we've got that information, that elements collection, we then call the then apply completion stage method, which simply returns the size, which is a count of the number of images in this page. So countImagesInPageAsync is a fairly straightforward method. You can see it calls a method that is not asynchronous. It uses a synchronous call. And so it calls it using then apply async. So it'll run in its own thread in the common fork join pool. So that's countImagesInPageAsync. Let's take a look at crawl links in PageAsync. That's a lot more interesting. And this is going to essentially traverse recursively if there's other links on a given page. So what this does is this also takes the page future that was passed to it, which is going to be triggered when the document's finished downloading asynchronously. And when it finishes, it calls the then compose async method, which is this really interesting variant on then apply async that will flatten completable futures. So we don't end up with nested completable futures. And what we're doing here is really pretty cool. We're going to call a helper method here called crawl links in page. And that's crawl links in page is going to return a completable future, and we want to denest it. So that's why we use then compose async. So let's go take a look at crawl links in page. Crawl links in page takes a document, an HTML document, and a depth. And what it does is it goes to that HTML document and it says, please find all the hyperlinks on this page by using the select method from the JSoup library, passing in the href string to say, find me all the hrefs. What comes back is an elements collection, and then we turn that into a stream of elements by using the stream method on elements. And then we go ahead and use the map intermediate operation to take each hyperlink, which is what we got back from select, takes each hyperlink and it recursively calls countImagesOnPageAndPageLinksAsync. We looked at countImagesOnPageAndPageLinksAsync at the very beginning. That's the one that starts out by doing the filter checks, getting the page asynchronously, and then calling countImagesOnPageAndPageLinksAsync. And you can see here that countImagesOnPageAndPageLinksAsync is going to use another JSoup wrapper to get the hyperlink that we need to continue our traversal. And this is kind of clever too. You can see here that if this is a local call, we're just going to use the href in order to be able to get the hyperlink that way, which would be into the local file system. If it's remote, it's going to use this abs:/href, which will get essentially a real hyperlink as opposed to a URI. So this will then recursively call countImagesOnPageAndPageLinksAsync. And of course, countImagesOnPageAndPageLinksAsync is going to return a completable future to an integer that will emit the number of images reachable from that hyperlink. And since there could be many hyperlinks in a document, we use map to essentially traverse over all of them. So what comes out of map, as you can see here, is a stream of completable futures to integers, each completable future being an indication of the subtotal of images that were reachable from that particular hyperlink. So what we're going to do now is we're going to use a very clever collector called the futures collector int stream, which we'll look at in the next part of the lesson. And that's going to return a completable future to an int stream that will be triggered when all the other processing, all the other completable futures are done. So when everything is finished running, then this completable future will trigger, and that will give us back an int stream. So we then use the then apply completion stage method to sum up all the subtotals that are in that int stream that comes back from futures collector int stream. And we'll look at that shortly. This technique is also something that you've seen used in your programming assignment for the completable futures portion of the course. Okay, so that is what happens here. Let's kind of pop back up a few levels, and we're going to get back to the place where we called countImagesOnPageAsync and crawl links in PageAsync. And both of those things give completable futures that come back to the combine counts method. And here's combine counts. Combine counts is actually very, very pithy. I probably didn't even need to make it its own little method, but what the heck, it didn't hurt anything. And what it does is it takes the images in page future and the images in links future. And when both of those things finish, we use the then combine completion stage method, the one that is triggered when two previous stages complete, to go ahead and sum the results. And you'll notice that we do this synchronously. There's no sense in summing two numbers together asynchronously because it's going to happen so fast, it's not worth running it in a background thread. So combine counts will then just kind of go off and combine those results. And then that, of course, percolates back up to the caller of countImagesOnPageAndPageLinksAsync. And if we keep popping back up enough, you'll see that that comes back up here into countImagesOnPageAsync. And then we're basically done with our recursive traversal. So that's a walkthrough through the bulk of the methods that are part of the image counter class. And you can see they're really cool. And we use recursion effectively. We use asynchronously very effectively. And the next thing we're going to do in part 3 of this lesson is we're going to talk about the futures collector int stream class and see how that works.